Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to welcome Sophie Strand as our next guest for this series of Borrowed Time conversations. We were just chatting before, and I was asking Sophie, how does she describe the totality of what she does at the moment? And Sophie suggested she's an ecological storyteller. Many of us probably first encountered Sophie as a poet through the work she was sharing in that form, and then more recently extracts from longer pieces of writing, which she recently described under the umbrella term ecological love stories. We'll be hearing more about that as we go, but you're going to be mainly listening to a conversation between Sophie and Richard Paval, who is art.earth's spirit guide, was the term we went with. I said, "Do you want to be called director?" And he said, "Well, let's go with spirit guide." So a couple of house things. While Sophie and Richard are talking, do log a question in chat, and I'll stack questions at the end. And you don't have to put the whole question into chat. You could just say, question about, and I think I can always see who's asking, so you don't even need to put your name, just say question about so-and-so, or just something, so I can try and pick not 6 questions all about the same thing. We'll try and take them all, obviously, but it depends how many there are. If I can remind you all to mute yourselves, then once Richard and Sophie start talking, then I'll ask you to unmute if you've submitted a question into chat, and then ask your question. And if you can ask it with your video on as well, that would be nice. I should mention that we're recording, so if anyone's not happy with that, you might want to leave your video off. You're welcome to just sort of listen silently, and you won't feature on the recording in any way. And lastly, just before handing over, I should say, of course, that we're now 1 month away from our 3-day creative summit, Borrowed Time. This is part of a series of events that Charlotte and Mark and Richard and I have all been involved in different ways. There was a parallel edition of the Dark Mountain Journal that came out in association with this, called Requiem, earlier. And our 3-day event, Borrowed Time on Death, Dying and Change, takes as one of its central themes ecological mourning or ecological grief, and the attempt to bring that into conversation with an understanding of death culture and death cultures, death and dying cultures in the widest sense of that word. One quick shout out before we hand over about that. If you've been following our work there, check out the new keynote who's joined us, who we're very excited about. Jennifer Abbott, director of the corporation, more recently of the new corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel, and the film that we'll be screening with an interview by Jennifer called The Magnitude of All Things, which is a study in ecological grief and personal bereavement. So it's sort of spookily apt for our event, which also spookily apt is coming out on the day, more or less, that COP starts, COP26. So there we go. With that, that's enough from me. Over to Richard and Sophie, and welcome, Sophie. And
thank you.
Over to you two.
Hi. I'm going to just boot Matt off the screen here, so it's just the two of us. And I will add my welcome and say that, I was introduced to Sophie by Matt. I'm not familiar with her work before that, but I've been able to do some reading. But before I even read anything, Sophie, of yours, I read your bio, and you talked about, and this is what you said that completely made me just want to move in, really. It says, you describe yourself as a neo-troubadour with a propensity to spin yarns that inevitably turn to love stories. So, and then I started to dig deeper and found so many connections, including the Hudson Valley being one, having lived up in the kind of northern bit of the Hudson Valley for 4 years, a while ago now. And another connection, you are based in Kingston, and I had a very dear friend, Pauline Oliveros, in Kingston, so we were just talking about that a little bit. But enough of me. I think I'd like to start just asking you to read from one of your pieces, and then we'll head off into a conversation.
Well, thank you, everyone here. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Matt. I'm very happy to be here. I will start off with my piece, Confessions of a Compost Heap. Okay. And so from hour to hour we ripe, and then from hour to hour we rot, and thereby hangs a tale, laments the melancholy Jacques in Shakespeare's comedy As You Like It, hinting at something the playwright understood intimately. Disorder and decay are just as crucial to a narrative as are order and fecundity. The story does not exist in a single pole of experience, but is articulated between ripeness and rot. The tragic play flows from fertility into rot, while the comedy reverses the causality, sprouting ripeness from initial decay. The question was looping in my head in the doctor's office. She was the main expert of my genetic condition, and without much grace, she was explaining to me the predictable course of my body's disintegration. Okay, you need a surgeon to look at your neck because your skull is essentially collapsing into your spine. Not that the surgeries are very effective, and with your lung functioning being what it is, we can expect your heart to begin to feel the effects, so we need to get you back to the cardiologist. I could feel myself start to disassociate. My hands were tingling. I felt my being condense into a nucleus of intensity between my eyes. The doctor's voice was glitching, moving up in pitch until it was too high for me to even hear. And then from hour to hour we rot, I thought, staring down at the pronounced veins in my hands that the doctor had informed me were a typical expression of connective tissue disease. My skin was too soft, my bones didn't want to stay in a solid shape. My heart was growing lazy, it was melting, I was breaking down. I imagined myself amorphous as a compost heap, and instead of talking, the doctor was circling me, pouring in water, tossing in a handful of salad greens, pulling out a worm and inspecting it with pleasure, every once in a while taking a trowel and flipping some of my moist soil. You're moving along well, I imagined her congratulating me. You're past the thermophilic phase and fully maturing. I'm seeing a lot of earthworms, a lot of millipedes. This is really good news. Evidence of intentional composting goes back as far as 12,000 years ago in Scotland, when fields filled with manure and human excrement were used to plant crops. There are examples of recycled organic waste for agricultural purposes in ancient India, China, and across the Middle East. The first written tract about composting can be found in a set of clay tablets dating back to King Sargon's reign during the Akkadian dynasty. In Egypt, composting was so esteemed that Cleopatra declared the compost heap's hero, the worm, sacred. In 160 BCE, the retired Roman general Cato the Elder wrote instructions on best practices for composting in his agricultural tract, De Agricultura. Composting is the process whereby plant and food waste decompose into a rich, nutritious soil filled with fungi, bacteria, and organisms. The soil produced from composting creates a nutritious and vibrant matrix for agricultural planting, with the added benefit that it also produces compounds that kill off and suppress pathogens that could harm crops. Greens and browns are the main ingredients of a good compost heap. Greens are characterized as being rich in nitrogen, moldy leaves, mowed grass, table scraps. Browns are richer in carbon, stalks, woody material, paper. The process is easy enough. Add water, put outside, let the heat, the moisture, the spores and pollen diffuse through the air do their job. Of course, you can be more precise about it, treading matter to increase surface area and aerating the pile. But decay is a process that winks playfully at human control. Even the attempt to create an ingredient list is a modern innovation, as demonstrated by the anarchic shitfields of the ancient Scots. Human and animal excrement combined with discarded food and plant waste provided an alchemical mix that needed little organization. The most important work is done by a decidedly inhuman force, or perhaps it's very human, given that our bodies are composed of more bacterial cells than human cells. The work is done by bacteria, fungi, and insects. These decomposers turn a compost heap into a web of appetites, chewing through waste, excreting nutrients in soil, producing heat that further encourages the decay process. A heap of inert matter is soon a pulsing, humming, sweating community of creation. What then is decay? Watching a compost heap transform into fertile soil, it can seem like decay is genesis. Decay is the first scene in a comedy of mycelial threads and millipedes and sprouting wildflowers, seeds invisibly deposited by a bird flying overhead. Sometimes I think about death as being the transition from solitary aliveness to an anarchic polyphony of aliveness. Years ago, a deer hit by a car managed to struggle into the woods at the periphery of my parents' property where it died. It was high summer, frying pan hot, the peeling birch bark almost crisping into cinders under unrelenting sunshine. Day after day, I would visit the carcass and watch as one life melted into a riot of lives. Worms, ants, maggots, beetles, mushrooms. Death was almost the moment when life overflowed its cup. It wasn't the end of life, it was the end of the singular. The deer decayed out of its shape into explosive generative plurality. One narrative diverged into 400 narratives. Some days I ask myself tenderly, curiously, what is happening to me? What is happening to this self, this body? I never returned to that doctor despite her prestige. I felt her prognosis was a bad story, a story I didn't want to hear and didn't want to tell. I know that words are spells, and every day I wake up and tell a different story about what health and vitality and miracles are available to me. But it is also important to honor what often bodily intimately feels like a slow decay. When old diets, herbs, physical therapy routines no longer work, it can feel like I'm melting. When a holiday passes and I'm reminded to look back at myself, I can suddenly see for a moment how much has changed physically. Am I decaying? Well, yes. But decay is always a day, a microbe, a rootlet away from sprouting. Maybe I'm losing touch with the self and melting into a more than human mind. I look at Shakespeare's catalog of plays. Every comedy begins with strife and breakdown. Every tragedy begins with health and well-being. If you played any narrative out longer, it would tip into its opposite. As Shakespeare's Jacques notes, it is between the ripe and the rot that thereby hangs a tale. If I feel myself like the compost heap beginning to melt, it means that I am also melting into another story, a bigger story, a wider cast of characters. Let me dance between ripe and rot. I don't know what act in the play comes next, but I know what my prayer is. Make me bigger than an eye. Make me good soil. Thanks.
Thank you. I think one of the things that most struck me about that piece when I first read it was this kind of link between the body and soil. That soil almost becomes a metaphor for the body, and you talk elsewhere about the mycorrhizome becoming a kind of healer. And I'm just curious to do you work with soil? Is soil something that is kind of part of your being? It feels like such a strong part of your work generally.
I mean, I grew up as a dirt baby. I grew up in the dirt. I grew up coming inside, my mom being like, we need to put you in the bath. But I'm very interested in soil as being alive, and particularly in mycelial networks as being connective tissue, connecting forests, creating the actual coherence of the matter that nourishes trees and plants and our crops, our food, our daily life. And my condition is connective tissue. So there's been a nice stratigraphic layering of meaning when I realized that my love of fungi and dirt also intimately played into what was happening in my own body.
So what is happening in your body that shouldn't be, what is happening that shouldn't be, and what is not happening that should be?
Well, it's a connective tissue disease, so it means that pretty much, well, every system in your body is made coherent by connective tissue: your eyes, your heart, your veins, your bones, your joints. So when you have connective tissue disease, it means all of those systems are liable to break down. Your body doesn't properly produce collagen. So it means that slowly things begin to break down in oftentimes very unpredictable and also outrageous ways. And you could kind of think of it as like a Marx Brother kind of like comedy if you want. And sometimes I like to think about that. Like, you know, you plug up one hole and then like 10 burst. And I know from speaking to you before that you're intimate with these kind of absurd, often comedic bodily experiences, these hard to classify events. Yeah, and I think for me, something that I've really tried to work with is not giving myself a prognosis, not telling myself what's supposed to happen, remaining curious about healing that could be unexpected.
I mean, healing. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I've interrupted you midstream.
No, I was gonna ask how you hold the kind of absurdity of sometimes unpredictable physical meltdowns.
Yeah, I mean, I think healing, when you have a disease which is incurable, as they say, then the notion of healing becomes something immediately temporary. That you know within yourself that okay, you may be really good today, and actually you may have gone through a process, whether it's a drug process or a surgical process that has made you better. But you actually, you know, in deep down that better is entirely relative, in the sense that, and that you could wake up tomorrow and not be better, and you know it in your body, even if it hasn't yet manifested. It's there inside. So I think that's the comedy of that is a difficult thing to describe, I think, because it comes from a sort of helplessness, but not a hopelessness. I think maybe for me that's the difference. That there's always hope. There's always a sense that the body will somehow keep itself alive, even if it doesn't always feel terribly alive.
Yeah. So something that I feel like it has offered to me, and I wonder if this maps onto your experience, is it gives me a certain urgency about when you know that things can shift so dramatically, so quickly. You know that when you need to do something, you should do it with whatever energy you have to do it as quickly as possible. And that is a gift that sometimes I want to give to people, especially in an age of ecological chaos, is, you know, don't put it off, do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the real sense of climate change touching all of our lives right now, often in quite scary ways, means we're all suddenly time limited in a way that we're just not used to thinking about. And my own disease, which is Crohn's disease, is not necessarily lifespan limiting. But I also know at the same time that there could be, you know, that life has to go on hold. So that's a mini death. That's a form of death, right there, where you feel that you're no longer functioning as a human being, because you have to park yourself.
Yeah.
So there is that sense. So that sense of urgency becomes a part of that, I think.
Yeah, I think about those moments as being between stories.
Yeah.
You know, the story doesn't deliver you to a conclusion or to anywhere. It just kind of falls apart. And you're not on any kind of linear progression. You're not the main character. You're not active. You know, you've lost all of the accessories of narrative. And those are very deeply uncanny moments. What do you feel like has carried you through those bardo realms?
That's a really good question, because I think very often when you are in those times, I don't think you think about, you know that you're going to come through the other side, and that's all there is. And therefore you are waiting. You're waiting for the body to do what it needs to do to get you through and reconnect you. So I don't think of it as being a process where I have techniques or processes I can call on to get through it. I simply know it's like everything that you've been through before. You kind of know that there's going to be a point of resolution. You're not quite sure when it's going to be, and there are some terrible times when you're on the upward trajectory and you stall or you fall. So I think what really moves me about your writing is that you have found a poetic way to respond to all of this, and I'd love to know when that happened. When were you able to start then kind of dealing with your broken body poetically in this way, and indeed, as you say, with a kind of comedy?
I mean, I think as a writer, and I'm sure you as a creative person would feel the same way, that you're always using your craft to try and work out the things that are most immediate to you. So I've probably been trying to write about this for a long time, but the kind of writing, the flavor of writing that I'm doing right now is relatively recent. I think it was born of, I think everyone collectively at the start of COVID experienced a narrative breakdown. It was a collective experience of what people like you and me go through in a much more personal way. And I also experienced a relationship breakdown. A lot of professional things didn't happen that were supposed to happen. It was a very interesting moment. And I think that it forced me to think about my medicine, and that I had become so dedicated to receiving medicine, and what would it look like to make it and to offer what tiny grains I had managed to figure out worked. And it really, I think the writing that I'm doing is a pretty desperate attempt to try and connect with people who've had similar experiences and trying to and create a sense of not being quite so alone. And it's worked. It's had a very kind of mycelial-minded life of its own. But yeah, so the work is really, it's desperate. And I think all my best writing comes from a kind of desperation. It's not super planned. I mean, it is planned, but it's deeper than that. It's about like climbing out of a pit, being like, I have to make it. And I really enjoyed what you said about that moment where you just have to trust that the body is going to figure it out, where you have to say, I can't think through this. I'm not, my cognition is not the best guide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious about we talked a little bit when we were chatting the other day about the difference in our healthcare systems that we come from. I tell myself every day that I extraordinarily blessed to live in a country where healthcare is not healthcare is genuinely a right, in the sense that whatever the problems may be with our system, there is no point at which someone is going to say to you, you can't come in here because you don't have, well, but whatever it might be, the right form, the right money, the right healthcare plan, whatever it might be. And so I think for me, therefore the difference becomes that money is not a motivating factor. And I just wonder how much of that you've encountered in your own kind of probably quite deep interactions with the American healthcare system.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a piece that's a little bit about this. I almost don't want to just like dive into the vitriol of that, of what it could summon in me. I think that the amount of money I've spent on trying to get well from doctors, medical doctors, from holistic New Age practitioners, is pretty criminal. And I think that it really influenced most people my age just try and not go to the doctor. And I think that I've seen people, women, a lot of times women, not get certain kinds of care fast enough that killed them. Like, you know, this isn't hearsay. These are people I know who, you know, had symptoms that probably should have been checked out, found out they had ovarian cancer, and that was it. And it really, I mean, I have so much medical debt. I can't even, I mean, and it's tangled up because I also had so many experiences where I could sue for malpractice. But then I think, do I want that to be my life? Do I want to open up that wound again and again and again? I think the thing I'm more interested in almost is how often it's women who have these really, really bad experiences, who are gaslit, who are overcharged for experiences. I mean, the thing that I think is not getting a lot of talk right now because we're in emergency mode with the pandemic is, you know, doctors abuse women and young women in their offices a lot, like do really inappropriate things. And this is, you know, I used to have these storytelling gatherings and a couple of them were focused on like, is this appropriate behavior from a doctor? What does this mean? I'm a chronically ill young woman. How do I handle these situations? So yeah, these are things I think about a lot.
Yeah. I just want to come back to your writing a little bit, and you talked about the work having changed recently, and I just wonder if that has anything to do with, you know, the pandemic, or is it just a kind of natural evolution in your work, or are you trying to tell a different story, or what?
My astrologer friend would say I'm in my Saturn return. But I think that I have seen all of my goals and ideas of what my life is going to look like break down. And it's caused a kind of tower card to go to the tarot experience again and again and again, where everything that I believe is possible and should happen, it melts and it leaves almost nothing behind. And I think that this work is me trying to create some kind of dirt. I mean, to go back to the piece I wrote, some dirt that if I don't get to do any of the projects I want to get to do, I've left behind some good dirt for other people to grow something in. And I think that I just want to kind of go back to an idea of authorship that belongs more to like a Homeric or an Orphic hymn tradition, where it's less about the author and it's more about the dirt that's being made that other people can mulch and come into, you know, an oral storytelling tradition. So I'm trying to tell stories and bring them into being in a way that invites other people in. So if I don't make it to the finish line, other people can take it over.
Yeah, and I think what I find interesting about your writing is that although it often references your bodily travails, it doesn't feel like it's defined by that.
I hope not.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you talked about you not wanting to become a person who is constantly, you know, suing the medical system, because that too is kind of self-definition that you know, nobody wants to be in that phase. So, you know, I wondered about your, how am I going to say this? The fact that you can constantly reference this. I think maybe it comes back to what you were just talking about, actually, about leaving, about dirt and about kind of leaving things for others to get their hands in and get dirty with and play around with. And I for me, the work feels very non-self-obsessed.
Oh, well, I hope. I mean, I think when you realize you might not get what you want, that you have to make yourself good. You have to make yourself a good meal for something else. I don't think that I think I'm a very proud person who's very desirous and wants lots of things. But I think that when you experience radical illness and, to be honest, pretty shattering violent sexual abuse, you realize that it creates, I think, a sense of porousness, of an involvedness with your world that can be alarming, but also helpful. When you're like, okay, if I don't make it, I'm still a part of everything. Yeah, I do think that my primary way of writing is fiction. That's my greatest love. And I do think that a lot of the writing I've been doing is almost like this preparatory, creating an appetite for the wild fiction that I'm writing. And I initially thought at the start of the pandemic, I'd finished these novels and I thought that they were going to get sold and move, and they didn't. They really, really didn't. And so I had to reassess. I had to say, what am I doing? What am I writing about? If these novels aren't moved, and now they are, now they're sold. So I think of this writing as being a kind of telling people what I'm about before they read my books. Yeah.
I'm curious to know a little bit more about the kind of complexity of the American. I'm not asking you to speak for America, but about you do live in that context. About the American response to the pandemic, which has obviously been extraordinarily diverse and perhaps is simply reflective of the nature of the Federacy anyway. But tell us a bit more about that, because I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think that it's been a mess. I think the simplest way to respond is to say it's just been mishandled from day one, and it continues to be mishandled. And I have a lot. I do think that the conversations about vaccines and about certain approaches have become so polarized. And whenever people are like, how do you feel about the vaccine? I want to say this whole binaristic conversation is about not talking about the environment.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about a human narrative. Like, who cares about the vaccine? Like, our world is on fire, you know? It seems like I'm a little tired of cultural criticism. I'm like, we don't have time for cultural criticism. This is boring. I think we're in late stage capitalism. I think that you can't trust anybody. And you also have to trust everything.
Okay.
So that's the hard part. And I think that's where I'm at. And I do think that people who've experienced really intense violence or really intense illness were prepared for this, because, and I wonder what your experience of this is you have that agility. You're like, I know that I have to be able to dance with the unexpected, to change my mind, to change my plan every day. So I do think that there was a certain aspect of my life that prepared me for this moment in America, perhaps. What is the flavor of the pandemic handling in England?
Well, I mean, for a long time, I thought it felt very grounded in, and there I use the word sensible, in the sense that I think that the extreme fringe of opinion was very muted, but I think it's changing. And the language has become much more confrontational, and the vaccine thing has become a kind of a cultural point of division, and I think that we faced with a government here who categorically in their bones, in their kind of right-wing bones, don't want to make rules. So there's been this kind of fundamental problem all along of a government whose nature is not not to upset, well, particularly a prime minister who doesn't like being unpopular, therefore doesn't like to force people to do things, and yet now is probably going to be faced with doing it again. So, but I think the biggest surprise I had about my response to it was the sense of fear that this thing, my body was already challenged enough without this thing, and what would it do to me? And I think as a child, I had asthma, and remember being 4 or 5 years old and not being able to breathe, and that fear of not being able to breathe, whether it's literal or metaphoric, has been with me ever since. And I think that this particular disease seems so linked to that I found myself just wanting to dig deeper and deeper into the hole and not ever come out. I think I was surprised by that.
I think that it has opened up a lot of trauma for people. I mean, I saw it in myself. Things that I thought were resolved were triggered by the whole experience, and that's been interesting. And I've tried to be available to being like, okay, so this is an alchemical container where this stuff is coming back to life for whatever reason. And I guess this is, with the curtains drawn in this liminal bardo, I guess this is where I get to do this work, as uncomfortable as it is. I've experienced serious anaphylaxis, so I'm empathic about the not breathing. It's like, the terror that comes along with it is crystalline. I think for me, one of the strangest experiences has been I isolated alone, like super alone for a really long time. And I've pretty much been experienced a level of alone, like real aloneness, like not seeing anybody, that I never thought I would. And I never chose. And I think something I've been struggling with is this, I feel like this experience has cornered me into a kind of enforced presentism with inability to make sense of the past or see into the future, and also an asceticism that I don't necessarily believe in. That's the question I have for you is, how do you balance the rules that you have to follow to take care of your health with living a life?
You mean in terms of the pandemic or generally?
Generally.
I've always for many years, I never talked about my illness. I never referred to it publicly at all, and I think that was a form of denial. And I did many things when I was younger that put where I stepped over so many lines that I made things worse. There's no question and some people would say I still do that. So in the desire to be defined by a disease, I don't let it put strictures on the way that I live. And it probably should a bit more. I think it's the last time when I went through a major surgical experience after a major flare. I kept saying to myself, "That's it. You are. There's nothing left. You're burned out. There's just nowhere else to go." But I picked up. I almost unconsciously picked up from that and came out of it. So I don't feel, in a curious way, I don't feel restricted by this disease, but I know at the same time that if I work as hard as I want to work, I can't do it anymore. Actually, I just can't do it anymore. So I can't damage it in quite the same way that I did. How about you? I mean, what are the limits that you are dealing with?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of limits that I can't cross because I would die. Certain foods that if I ate them, I would have anaphylaxis. But I think something I've struggled with is this kind of moral weight that you are gifted with when you become ill, which is that you always have to act correctly, because why would you
why would you deliberately not? Yeah.
And especially, I mean, one of the big things that I've written about is this idea of purity, that if you're still sick or if you're still feeling bad, you must be doing something wrong. And that's something I'm really still struggling with, is the sense that, like, this flare happened, what did I do? How did I act incorrectly? And that's huge. I think that, it's still something I'm really massaging and working with, especially because so many health practitioners would give up on me and then blame me for not having done something correctly. And it's not what I'm trying to do is to not be purified, to be a compost heap, to realize that you have to make your life livable. Yeah. And sometimes sometimes life being livable is drinking coffee, even though maybe it's not the best thing. You need that. But it's a ongoing conversation internally for me about what that looks like. And I think that there's a lot of self-chastisement that I do about feeling bad. I'm like, oh, I did that.
No, me too. Blame is an interesting thing. Let's not go any deeper. Let's bring Matt in, because I think we've got some questions coming in to the chat. So I'm going to just bring Matt on the screen here. And
fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that, Sophie and Richard. But really, there's so much there. Any questions I had just got completely entangled with all the other questions and sort of dug themselves back into the compost. So I have questions, and I'm not sure I can ask any of them in less than 15 minutes, so I'll be careful. Mark says he has something he'd like to say. And that's enough of a cue in. You don't have to put anything coherent into the chat thread to ask a question. You can just sort of stick your hand up there. But Mark, your hand is up. Unmute, and you're still muted. You know that.
Thanks so much, Sophie and Richard. Hi. I just wanted to say, Sophie, when you were talking about the entanglement of the connective tissue linked with with the entanglement of mycorrhizal networks and the earth and the planet and things like this, and your whole attitude towards being alive and making that creative with writing was really inspiring, because those of us who, in a sense, are less aware of an illness we might have, or we're just generally healthy. I think there's I've just seen tonight that there is, in what you're saying actually is more useful if you have not something maybe as serious as what you and Richard are talking about, but if you have something wrong, actually that's a really positive thing. It's like it puts you so in the moment, and so to be able to deal with, to face life in a way that has an intensity and urgency about it that, for example, I mean, I tend to be quite intense anyway, but I have to go through a process of, telling myself that, we might not be to here tomorrow. Things are temporary. Things are, and then it's only in those moments where sudden. I'm going through my Saturn return as well, by the way, and it's only when those things are almost sometimes from the outside intense that there's a shock that awakes you up to the things you're talking about. So I think this is really valuable for all of us, actually. The things you've been talking about, and that's basically what I want to say. I could say loads of other things, but thank you so much. It's really it's awesome, really.
Yeah, and I would hope that the people who are experiencing these unclassifiable illnesses speak up so that not everybody has to get them. And that's the thing, is like, I never would want to gift this to anybody. So why not share the knowledge I have so that other people can wake up without this excruciating, agonizing tunnel experience. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I knew when I came here, Sophie, that one of the things that first connected me to your writing, actually, as an EDS, am I saying it right? An EDS sufferer, and the way you were addressing that, the way that was entangled in your work, is that my partner has chronic CFS, ME, has had for 22 years or so. And one of the things that we've lived with for a long time is the kind of paradoxical relationship to get better stories. It's like you may not be able to you may not want to completely abandon stories based on recovery, but anyone who's suffered long chronic illness will know how oppressive they can be. And you obviously addressed that explicitly. When I said the stories were getting entangled, it was when you started talking about your condition just now. It was just sort of spookily, poetically, like you were talking about climate change, the breakdown of connective tissue, the way things connect to each other, the way that changes can happen with a kind of sudden violence as well as an incremental process. And that's enough to be going with, maybe.
I think our wounding has to show us where something else is wounded. And I think when we get super fixated on the self, on healing the self, we're not really doing anything. So we have to understand where our wounds are telling us to look. What is the shape? What is the shape of the wound? The shape of my wound is, I am very, very involved and interested in fungi. So for me, that's my kind of lyrical ideogram. But for other people, their illness may be showing them another type of wounding in the environment. So I just always want to decenter our self-oriented narratives and our human narratives. Like, how can our narratives of illness ecologically root us into where we are and what we're really experiencing? I don't know if you have, your partner has found any way of, any mirror for their experience.
Yeah, I can hear Rachel saying, "I'll speak for that myself, thank you." Or not. Gardening, so we our partnership is one where she actually handles. I'm almost entirely plant blind and just spend my time writing ecological blogs and emails and chat threads, and she actually gardens. So that's a kind of ground. She's the kind of grounded one that connects with things. When you were talking about desperation as well, and writing coming from desperation, and that sense of living an unfinished story, or a story you might not finish, that was incredibly powerful for me. And I was thinking, I had a moment a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018. I went to a talk by a Christian priest called Lucy Larkin, who was giving a talk on spirituality and ecology. And she was, she gave a good talk in some ways, but it was all this narrative about, we've got 12 years to save the world. And, the Green Movement's always done this. We've got to do it by then because you just don't want to go there if we don't. And I remember thinking, so I would like to prepare good stories to be around for when today's 8-year-olds are 20, because we all know that we're not going to do anything like that in 12 years. So let's start having that conversation now. And it reminded me of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine as well, that maybe what we're doing is just bringing unfinished stories as mini, like your lovely story about the hermit crabs, just leaving piles of shells around for people to kind of be able to climb into. Those of you who haven't read The Attachment, or maybe you will have, the wonderful excerpts that Sophie read, and there's another one about, what was it? The vacancy chain of hermit crabs, which is a new one on me and it's going to stick in my mind forever. That wasn't really a question, it was just a ramble. So is any part of that you want to pick up too?
No, I really resonate with this kind of constant human need to create some control narrative. Like this amount of time, by this time, we're going to do this. And I think a lot of carbon narratives are actually obscuring what's happening. Like if we do this, if we reduce this, and climate change is so much just bigger than CO2 at this point. And I think for me, we have to get good at living in a rubble ecology, salvaging what can be salvaged, not trying to finish or complete things, because those are human arrow of time conceits. They're conceits. The idea of finishing anything, the idea that evolution is finished with us, that we're not in process. I think, if I'm devoted to anything, it's the kind of storytelling that is always evolving, never actually finishing, and never actually getting born. So stories that are almost aborted, that are given up, that are between shells.
Fantastic.
And I think I'm interested, actually. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My favorite story is Tristan and Isolde, and those legends. And one of my favorite things is that the oldest versions of the story are actually a composite of two unfinished stories, both authors of whom probably died while writing it. And that the oldest version of Tristan that comes down to us is this composite of two different aborted stories.
But I mean, isn't that almost Homeric by definition, that stories should never be given birth? They're constantly being told and retold and reshaped and reimagined, actually, so that we can go back to a story as old as Tristan and Isolde and take completely new things away from it and change it too. Yeah.
Before everyone came into the room, we were talking to Sophie about Sophie's hoping to do a spell in Cornwall soon, and we were talking about the fact that art.earth runs short courses, among other things. And I just feel like there's a short course taking shape in this room today somehow, but I can't quite see what it is. I wanted to throw an image at you that you may well know, but it came up for me really strongly reading your lovely passage about the hermit crabs. It's from Coleridge, and I remember Coleridge talking about in his Biographica Literaria. He talks about the horned beetle, and how the larva of the horned beetle, when it goes into pupation, it builds itself a chrysalis, and the chrysalis includes the shape of its long antennae. It includes a space for these long antennae that don't yet exist because it hasn't yet metamorphosed. And he's talking about that as an image for what poetry does, or for, you could say, for what storytelling does. And I don't want to kind of re-singularize it. I really like what you've said about the way stories arise between us. They're not just something we make. But I wondered, for you, writing out of that desperation you talked about, writing out of that, that pressing, visceral urgency, if there was any more you wanted to say about your experience of the kind of mystery of that process where, as you might say, the work knows where it wants to go and you just follow. It creates spaces that you can.
I love that image a lot. Let me have to do some research about that. I think for me, the urgency is an urgency that is not of me. And I think that's what I want to encourage people to do, is let themselves be told, let their work, let them become a channel for some other type of storytelling. And to be perfectly honest, the writing I've been doing has not been fun. It's been kind of manic and all-consuming, and the research has been intense, and it's felt like I'm doing something for someone else. And when we think that our whole body has more bacterial cells than human cells, that, viruses taught us how to develop placentas, when we think of the microbiome and the fungi we're breathing in, I start to wonder who's telling me. And that can be frightening, but it can also be liberating, which is, I would like to not tell human stories. I would like something else to move through me with urgency. And one of the essays that's been very inspiring to me is The Duende by Garcia Lorca. And this idea of inspiration as being almost torturous, as dancing in the wound, as letting yourself be taken over. And well, you have to be careful when you make yourself available to something else, to something else's story. But it's also perhaps what we need to do right now, a kind of symbiosine, I think is what Glenn Albrecht calls it. We need to fuse with other beings and with other beings' needs and desires.
Tamsin, I just want to invite Tamsin to come on, because she made an interesting point about in the chat about well, Tamsin, I'll let you say it.
Sorry, I missed that. I was too.
That's right, you were busy, so we swapped roles there.
Hi. I'm eating my tea, so apologies.
It's okay.
My background is in Chinese medicine, and my professional background, and we think of everything as qi, which I'm sure you all know, but it means that there's this constant interchange and sort of flow between the way we like to think of ourselves as individuals and the universe that we exist in, if we think of it like that. And so it's very difficult to separate those things. It's quite difficult to even think about, I'm human, these are other, because constantly what I see when I look out of my window and look at the sea and look at the weather over the sea, it's constantly reflecting back on me and the people that I know, the people I treat, lots of people who have these types of autoimmune, what are called autoimmune diseases, the things which people know so little about, but which are like a symptom of the earth. They're like a mirror of what we've created in the world around us. It's almost as if we've made it extant. Now it's reflecting on our interior much more, and with this huge increase in the numbers of people who are sort of having to deal with these types of autoimmune diseases. And so, yes, for me, it's this constant interchange of backwards and forwards, this flow of qi, which the one informs the other informs one. I don't know whether I'm making much sense, but
yeah,
if I get stuck inside myself and I look at what it is we've created in the world, or the difficulties that we've created in the world, then I see, a macrocosm of the microcosm, and that helps me manage my interior world. And then, as you say, Sophie, I have to come back out again all the time, because we're just all sort of one.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase I've been using for me personally, is the animate everything, which is that it encompasses the patchiness, the heterogeneity of the connections, that we all are connected, but not everything is connected to everything. And I do think this is a very dangerous moment for universalisms and for kind of homogenizing universalism, that we have to be really careful to understand that ecosystems are different, and different ecological knowledge cannot be transplanted. And so your experience of being rooted in a place is going to necessarily be different in a different place. I mean, the thing for me that is very helpful is mushrooms, which is that we can think of individuals as fruiting bodies, the reproductive events of underground mycorrhizal systems. But when you pour, fungi don't really have any kind of discrete morphological structure. They just kind of get poured into a landscape and they fill in the gaps. They're the connective tissue. And I think that it's really important to know that we have to learn how to fill these spaces of connectivity, that we have to learn how to be the connection, that we can see that the world is us and in us, and people with autoimmunity and with health issues are incredibly aware of that metabolic looping, your sensitivity, the fact that you are an instrument that's being played by the elements. But you also have to understand that that connectivity comes with responsibility and culpability, and with specific ecological knowledge. And I think one of the things that has been frustrating me lately is there's a move towards a kind of eco-awakening that has no substance, that has no rootedness, it has no particulars. It doesn't tell you how to live right where you are. You know, people are drawn towards charismatic causes, charismatic animals. I want to say, go outside where you are, learn the grass behind your house.
That feels like a really lovely point to begin to kind of approach our wrap up, that kind of grounded specificity and not those kind of colonizing universalisms that, we haven't mentioned Dark Mountain much tonight, but I think that was one of the things that they've done so well over the last 10 years is to sort of go into the particular local voice and resist that kind of universalizing narrative. I wanted just to end, and again, this is just a thought. We're we're just past 8. We didn't really get going until 8 minutes past, so we're kind of still in the last few minutes. But wanted to just come right back to our theme that created the context for this conversation, which was borrowed time. And I was thinking that one of the things that's come up for me quite powerfully tonight, that's implicit in that title, and you spoke. I can just feel my understanding of it having been changed in this last hour, is this sense of hurry we live with, this sense of we've got to sort it out now. I mentioned it tangentially before, but I was thinking about something you said earlier reminded me of Audre Lorde, and there's if any of you have seen it or haven't seen it, there's a very powerful film called Audre Lorde, The Berlin Years, about her time in Berlin. And she's quoted in there as saying, I always knew I was planting a tree that I wouldn't live to sit in the shade of. So something like that. Or maybe I spliced that. That was the spirit of it anyway. And I remember thinking then how that doesn't seem like a sense of time we have anymore. That we somehow now it's all too short term. And as you were talking, I was thinking, no, it's not. There's no more short. How could it be more short term? Of course it's not more short term. It's just that we can't see. It's getting harder and harder to see what it might be like for those who are picking up our unfinished stories. And so you don't have, we're near the end, but if there's anything you want to say about that sense of living on borrowed time, living with time running out.
Oh, well, thank you for summoning Audre Lorde. She is I pray to her every morning. Her writing has kept me alive. So it feels nice that she has been summoned here. I think that we have to, personally, I have to stop thinking about me or human beings surviving and start thinking about the general aliveness and how my stories could bloom into and how I could plant a tree that would inhabit and increase the general aliveness rather than being kind of species-centric. I'm just trying to really relax my idea of the human. Because when I start thinking about what it will be like for children in 20 years, you feel the constriction and the paralysis. You think, I don't know. But when you think that there will always be flowers, there will always be mud and rain, of some sort. There's always going to be a metabolic looping of heat and matter. And I'm thinking on my feet right now. I think for me, ecological storytelling means that human beings aren't the main character. So I think for me, borrowed time is saying, okay, if you're a supporting character, how can you increase the narrative juice? Fantastic.
I feel like we might steal that and use it as a strap line when we get there in a month's time. That's a lovely note to end on. So
thanks so much.
I just want to thank everyone for coming, and really, obviously, especially thanks Sophie and you too, Richard, and everyone who's asked questions. And just in closing, to remind everyone, if you haven't kind of checked it out yet, have a look at the Borrowed Time webpage, borrowed-time.info. And we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. It's all going to be online now, obviously, so you can join it from anywhere in the world. And we're going to try and make something that's very easy to come into and interact with on the terms you want to, for as much as you want to. So some of the events will be standalone, like Bio Komalafe's talk, and we're hoping our other keynote with Jennifer Abbott may also be something you can attend as a standalone. And as with Sophie's talk today, we'll share a lot of it online for free afterwards. We're very keen. One of the principles we brought to this is that, we've all got to live, with or without salaries. But it just feels so important coming into this not to be getting into that kind of extractivist mindset of monetizing the mass extinction event, you know what I mean? It's because it's a thing. But I think that's, Richard, have I forgotten anything in the wrap? Is there anything you want to say?
Absolutely. I think I want to say a huge thank you to Sophie and
thank you, Richard.
Lovely to talk, and thanks everybody else for coming. And do come along to Borrowed Time to the main event. This is we have one more event coming up on October 15th, but that is now full, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. But it will have a presence on the website. It's called Michelle Atherton is offering a celebration regathering. It's very much about personal stories, so which is why we wanted a small group of people. But we will share it afterwards. And Michelle will come along to the main symposium and talk about it as well. So thank you, everybody. It's been lovely to have you, and we will hopefully see you again soon.
Thanks again, Sophie.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Look forward to seeing you in Cornwall. We'll make it happen.
Hopefully.